A lady said to me one day, my husband and I had a serious religious difference. He thinks he's God, but I don't. He was, of course, kidding with me. But religious differences are something not to be taken lightly. And in particular, when we discover the religious differences that exist within our own selves. In particular, I'm referring to when we allow doubt to come in and be mixed with our faith. James speaks about this in his epistle. He calls it double-mindedness. And then he goes on to say, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways, and no one wants that. I bring this up because in our lesson to Romans, we have before us today the very uncomfortable topic of suffering. Trying to reconcile why good God would allow suffering. Trying to reconcile that within ourselves is not an easy task. And it's very easy at that point to kind of let doubt sink in, to become maybe conflicted. Or a lot of times I think what we do is we just try to ignore the subject altogether. I'm just going to put it out of my mind, but ignoring it doesn't make it go away. And then if suffering hits you and you're unprepared for it, then doubt enters in, you become double-minded, and you become unstable in all your ways. So as unpleasant a topic as it is, I think it's important to go ahead and bite the bullet and try to address suffering head on so that you're prepared for what comes instead of being caught by surprise. I think the first thing that's important, though, to consider is that we shouldn't look for quick answers or platitudes when it comes to suffering and the goodness of God. The book of Job is one of the longest books of the Bible, 42 chapters. And so we conclude from this that if the Lord is going to take 42 chapters to address human suffering, we shouldn't settle for little pithy statements like, God won't let you have more than you can handle. That just does not cut it, and we shouldn't try to accept that as some sort of an answer. Second, though, we cannot settle for answers about human suffering that call into question the character and the nature of God. We cannot conclude that He's not all-powerful. We cannot conclude that He's not all-loving. Nor is it valid for us as Christians to look to non-theistic powers or answers like fate or like karma. Those are no good for us either. And third, as much as we may want it, it is not an option for us just to retreat from the world and try to avoid suffering altogether. That's one of the conclusions we can draw from this gospel that we read about the wheat and the tares. As long as there's Christians in the world, and as long as there's non-Christians in the world, as long as there's wheat and tares and they coexist, there's going to be a conflict. And Jesus points out things are going to be made right at the end of the age. He says, when the angels come to gather out of His kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers and throw them into the fiery furnace. So if we're expecting some kind of peace or some kind of justice in our lifetime, I think we've got a long wait. It doesn't mean we should not be working for it. But beloved, don't hold your breath, because this stuff happens at the end of the age. Allow me to take just a quick digression. You note that He says, first gather the weeds. And then He says, then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Kind of sounds like the weeds are what's taken, and the wheat is what's left behind. Don't go writing Tim LaHaye just because he got it wrong. It's okay. It's okay. Okay, back to the topic of being double-minded. Around 2008, when the economy imploded, I was listening to an interview of a life coach. And they were asking, what perspective should we have to kind of get through this very challenging time? And the life coach said that he likes to think of it as a necessity to develop what he called mental toughness. And then he went on to use my parents' generation as an example. They lived through the Great Depression. My mother had stories when I was a kid of them picking apples from the neighbor's property, and all they had to eat that night was applesauce. And this is the same generation that fought in World War II. They came back from that horror, started their careers, built their homes, sent their kids off to college. The life coach said every generation actually faces very difficult times. Every generation does. And he said this is our time to learn to shine like the great generation. Now, I think a lot of what he said is true, but probably where I would disagree with him is I do not believe that the answer for mental toughness simply comes from reaching down within ourselves and drawing upon our own reserves. James' answer for gaining mental toughness was this, and avoiding being double-minded. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. It is the wisdom of God that grants us mental toughness. As we develop God's perspective on life, we find ourselves standing on a solid rock and not on the shifting sands of the culture. So it's with that perspective of gaining a mental toughness through God's perspective. Let's go back to Romans and look at God's wisdom about suffering. First, I think we need to define suffering, as silly as that sounds, because if you just think we're talking here about persecution, you're cutting yourself short. I'm sure Paul is talking, including persecution and suffering. I mean, think about what all that man went through. He was in prison, he was beaten, he was shipwrecked, he was stoned. So surely it includes persecution for the sake of the gospel. Now, while that may not be our immediate experience here as Tennessee Christians, you know it's going all around the world, and not just in Muslim countries. I've been corresponding with a Pakistani priest, Father Babu, who has escaped persecution in Pakistan, and they're now living as refugees in Thailand, but the Thailand government's treating them as criminals, and so they're getting like an advice from both sides, and yet they're saying Mass every week and being faithful brothers and sisters in Christ. So yeah, suffering includes persecution. But Paul goes on to say that even creation itself is suffering, therefore suffering is not just limited to persecution, if creation itself is suffering. Why is creation suffering? Because of the universal and damnable consequences of the fall. It was not God who introduced sin into the world, it was Adam who introduced sin into the world. And not only man is warped by sin, but creation itself is suffering the experiences of the fall. Paul says, we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth unto now. Why is that important to know? It's important to understand that suffering is not just about persecution, so that you know that you can turn to the Lord no matter what the cause is if you're suffering. Not just being oppressed for your faith, but that includes illness, it includes staying in a very difficult marriage, it includes being treated unfriendly by other people. There can be a host of reasons you're suffering, and for whatever reason it is, come to the one who is the balm of Gilead. Now, in this passage, in this very brief passage, I think three things I'm pulling out that Paul points us here on how to enlarge our, how to have tough-mindedness. First thing is, he calls on us, we've got to enlarge our vision. He says, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth being compared with the glory that is to be revealed. Now, I admit that's easier said than done. I mean, when you're suffering, it's really hard to look up to the horizon. When you mash your thumb with a hammer, you don't immediately think about your upcoming vacation to the beach, right? I mean, that's very difficult to do when you're in the middle of that kind of pain. But by the grace of God, we can have our minds transformed by His truth to know that whatever you're going through right now, no matter how bad it is, it's not even to be compared to how good it's going to get. No matter how bad it is now, it's not to be compared to how good it's going to get. Some of you have already experienced this kind of in a microcosmic way in your own lives, right? Some of you have gone through stuff in the past that like to have killed you, and you thought, I will never get through this. And then years later, you're such a good place in life, you look back during that very dark period and wonder, why did I fret so much? During that very difficult time, you cannot see the hand of God operating. But when you get to a good place, you can look back and see His fingerprints all over every bit of what happened to you, every bit of it. You are a living testimony now that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called to His purpose. Now, if that's true of us in kind of a microcosmic way, imagine the glory that we're going to experience. Infinitely better place than now. So in the midst of your present suffering, enlarge your vision to include the glory that's going to come. Your suffering includes some form of injustice. You can also take rest in the knowledge, going back to Jesus' statement in the Gospels, that the wheat and the tares are going to get fixed as they should be in the end. In the end, injustice will be answered. So you don't have to see the answer now. The second piece of wisdom that God gives us through Paul to make us mentally tough is that we are to have hope. He says, not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies, for in this hope we are saved. Now we need to be clear here, because when the Bible uses the word hope, It's very different than hope that we use in common parlance. When we speak of hope, we speak about an uncertainty. I hope this year I'll get a raise. And the reason we hope for it is it may or it may not happen. But when the Bible uses the word hope, it is a reality or a fact that simply hasn't yet been seen or experienced, but you can still take it to the bank. St. Paul calls on us, for example, to have hope in the resurrection in his letter to the Thessalonians. So Jesus' resurrection is proof that you will also be raised from the dead. And that proof is as certain as it can be, and that's why you have hope. You haven't seen it yet, and so you hope for it. The hope that we have in the midst of suffering is certainty that we will be fully adopted as God's children, our bodies will be raised from the dead, we will be raised incorruptible, and all that is wrong, both with your life and all this creation, will be made right, and that is as certain, even more certain, than the sun rising tomorrow morning. That's hope, and that's what we're to ground ourselves in. It's the anchor of our soul, the Scripture says. Lastly, St. Paul calls us to mental toughness by adding to our hope patience. He says this: now hope that is seen is not hope, but who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. I want to tread lightly here, because if you're speaking to somebody who is suffering and you tell them to be patient, you could get punched in the face, right? That's not a really good timing to bring out that quality. But notice that St. Paul does not call us for patience for the sake of patience, but he connects patience with biblical hope in such a way that the patience he's talking about really is the fruit of the hope that we have. It's the fruit of the hope that we have. If I truly believe that all things will be made right at the end of the age, then I don't have to have all things made right today. I mean, your mantra needs to be wheat and tares, baby, wheat and tares. You suffered injustice, wheat and tares, baby, wheat and tares. You get treated wrongly, wheat and tares, baby, wheat and tares. Your day's coming, wheat and tares, baby. You can hang in there if you've got that kind of long-range perspective. I don't have to be bothered that the wicked are prospering, that my boss is a jerk, that I'm being treated wrongly. I don't have to have people that have wronged me come ask my forgiveness. It's wheat and tares, baby. It's going to work out in the end. Whose job is it to collect the wheat and tares anyway? It's the angels. It's not my job. That's out of my pay grade, right? The angels are called to do this. And so all I've got to do is look to the one who's going to wrap it all up and make it all right. And as an added bonus then, the Lord blesses our patience by using everything that we're going through to our good. I love this line in one of our great hymns. When through fiery trials thy pathway shall lie, my grace all sufficient shall be thy supply. The flame shall not hurt thee, thy only design, the dross to consume, and thy gold to refine. All things work together for good for those who love God and are called to his purpose, including suffering. If we will embrace this teaching of Paul about suffering, then we'll be spiritually tough-minded. And I think the great benefit of that is we lose fear out of our life. What can touch you that doesn't have to first go through the shepherd's hand? What do you have to be afraid of? Nothing. Because the Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want. Let me end with this prayer from the prayer that we just prayed. Let's pray. It's from our psalm today. Teach me your way, O Lord, and I will walk in your truth. Knit my heart to you that I may fear your name. I will thank you, O Lord my God, with all my heart, and glorify your name forevermore.